Hello, everybody. It's Stephen Gray here. Back to doing some of my YouTube interviews on the Stephen Gray Vision YouTube channel. If you're interested, there's a collection of about 30 of them with leading influencers in psychedelics and related fields. And today I'm interviewing Jeremy Narby, who many of you may know. He got on the map, so to speak, with people with his lovely and influential, I would say, popular book, The Cosmic Serpent, that he published, that was published in 1999, and which I read back then, I believe. In any case, here's a brief bit of biographical information about Jeremy before we jump into our interview. He earned a doctorate in anthropology from Stanford University. For 35 years, he worked with the Swiss NGO Nouvelle Planète, supporting the initiatives of indigenous Amazonian communities with a focus on land rights, bilingual education, and sustainable forestry. As I said, Jeremy is the author of Cosmic Serpent and several other books since then. And in particular, the reason that I wanted to talk to him today is we have kept in touch occasionally over the years. And I found out that he has a new book coming out. It's not out yet as of this interview. If you are watching or listening to this prior to April of 2026, the book is not out yet, but it can be pre-ordered. And after that, you will find this book. And I have read it cover to cover. It's an excellent book. It covers so many different aspects of this plant, as he says, the plant and the drug, which is an interesting sort of separation there. So we'll maybe find out some more about that. Anyway, welcome, Jeremy, again.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a
Yeah.
pleasure to speak with you always.
Yeah, great. Well, let's just dive right into it all then. So actually, this let's start with this one. Kind of an obvious question, I suppose. Why did you spend over 4 years of your life investigating and writing about this plant?
Well, I'd spent several years in my life before writing about other plants, in particular ayahuasca, tobacco. I did a book in 2021 with an Amazonian expert called Plant Teachers, Ayahuasca, Tobacco and the Pursuit of Knowledge. So it was really about those two Amazonian plants. Um, and I think plants in general are interesting. Each specific, basil is interesting, parsley is interesting, just a blade of grass is interesting.
Mhm.
Uh, but so here was, I've actually used cannabis all my adult life and never spoken about it or written about it. In fact, used it to write about other psychoactive plants. And around 2019, 2020, maybe because it was becoming legal in places where I grew up in Montreal, Canada. In 2019, I went to Montreal and it had become legal in Canada. So there was something that was changing. I thought, well, why don't I try? I'd never actually read that much about cannabis. I'd consumed it, I'd smoked it, I'd vaporized it, I'd grown it. Uh, I felt like I knew the plant pretty well. And I'd always say, I'd write about tobacco. I'd say tobacco is not my plant. It's true. I don't really enjoy tobacco that much. I don't smoke it or whatever. Um, well, if tobacco is not my plant, I tell you, cannabis is my plant, but often I wouldn't say that. Um, but so, and sometimes you don't want to write about your friends. They say that. So I've been writing about these other kind of distant plants, but not about the one that was part of my daily life. And then finally I thought, well, I could do that.
Mhm.
And at first, I thought it would be kind of a little book, like the book that we did on tobacco and ayahuasca was a pretty slim volume.
Yeah, I've read it. It's good, by the way.
Um, but so the idea was that kind of everything you need to know about this plant in not very many pages, I thought. that was the initial sort of idea of, okay, I'll start looking into it. Um, and I also had the leisure. I had time ahead of me. You know, it's kind of like when you suddenly there are years when your life doesn't really give you the opportunity of like writing a book because you know it's going to take a long time. Um, I thought that actually writing about cannabis, I knew it was going to be complicated, kind of longer than ayahuasca and tobacco. I thought it would take 2 years. Just saying, when I wrote The Cosmic Serpent, that took 2 years. Um, I wrote Intelligence in Nature, that took 3 years. So I thought, okay, a book about cannabis take 2 years. And I write without a plan, you know, so I don't say I'm going to address this and then I'll do a chapter about that. It's more like I'm going to try to tell the whole story. And so let's start at the beginning. How long has this plant been around? Where does it come from? What do we know about its, you know, prehistory? And how do we know about it before there were written texts about it?
Hmm.
And moving forward, and it just uh, um, well, it's a long and complex story. Also, not just because it's a complex plant, but it has a long, deep relation with human beings. I mean, it was one of the first plants that people cultivated
Hmm.
12,000 years ago, somewhere in China, it would seem. So it's been with humans for a long time. It's been used for all kinds of things like rope, fiber, medicines. Um, so it's a kind of a multiple, like a Swiss Army knife plant, uh, multiple uses in multiple places. And then as soon as science got a hold of it, so we're talking European people in the 17th, 18th century, it showed how complicated it was because the plant grew in Europe and was known for its fibers, but was unknown for its psychoactive properties. But when Europeans arrived in India and they saw the same plant, except that Indians were not using it for fiber, but for producing an intoxicating herb, the European scientists, I mean, Linnaeus, who first classified all the plants, was the first to call it Cannabis sativa L, as in Linnaeus. He said this is all one species.
Hmm.
Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the French biologist, came and said, no, 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 it's two species. I mean, from the start, it was contentious in terms of its
Right.
identity. So it's been a complicated, enigmatic, useful plant that goes back deep in human history, and it also has a complex chemistry that is poorly understood because for half the 20th century, it was illegal and very difficult to study. So, which makes this story even more complicated. Yeah, how do you know what you know about the past of cannabis when
Hmm.
in fact it wasn't studied? You know, so that's also why I think it took me 4 years rather than two to feel
Hmm.
like I kind of covered what needed covering, so that the whole story was there. And I didn't want to sort of stop and just say, okay, well, I've had enough. You know, my wife was very patient.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going
Well,
back to the office to work on my book. Yes, dear. I'll bring you some coffee.
well, I think ideally, so to speak, when you get into a project like that, the project becomes the boss. You know, you do it until it feels right. You know, that's the sort of the artist view, I guess you could say. So you mentioned briefly just a moment ago the history. You know, this long, and complicated history we have the plant in the book. I've read, I don't know, half a dozen books on cannabis, including books on history and so on. And there was still a bunch of material in your book that I had not encountered. So I wonder, just kind of to regale people who might be viewing this and or listening to it, do you have some sort of favorite anecdotes or stories about that history?
Well, yeah, I tried to put in the book stuff that surprised me that I didn't know, And so one of the things that I was pretty surprised to learn about was about sadhus in India. I mean, the first thing is that it would seem that people in India didn't smoke, chillums or anything really. They didn't smoke until the late 16th century when the Portuguese introduced tobacco from the Americas. Tobacco took on like wildfire in India starting 1600, and all levels of Indian society, people were smoking tobacco in coconut hookahs or fancy hookahs if they were rich Indians. The chillum is the part of the hookah in which you put the tobacco. And during that period, yes, there was ganja, cannabis in India, but it was mainly toasted and eaten, or they make a drink with it, bang. So you would drink cannabis or you would eat it, but people didn't smoke it. And then between 1600 and 1800, gradually people started smoking cannabis. It only became a sort of more people in India smoked cannabis than ate it or drank it around 1850. So that's already pretty late. Meanwhile, the sadhus were not the people that we imagine, just these cool people with matted hair smoking chillums. Um, Oftentimes, yes, they were naked, it would seem, but as soon as the British showed up, there were conflicts between the sadhus and fakirs on the one hand, and the British authorities on the other hand. And the sadhus would go around, they were roaming mendicants, they would beg, but it was also that was their way of imposing taxes. The British wanted to impose taxes. The sadhus were not Pacific, they were warriors.
Hmm,
And they used cannabis to practice austerities. They would hang out in cold places like Kashmir with no clothes on, just drinking a lot of bang. That's how they did it. And you have reports by like Scottish sea captains in 1720, and their boats were attacked near Bombay by these sadhus, and they drink their hemp drink, and then they let their hair down, and nothing can stop them. So they would use it to gain courage for battles, and this is who the sadhus were until the British pacified them. In other words, forbid them from using arms.
hmm.
And this is around 1800, and this is when the sadhus really settle down, and then they start smoking ganja. All they do is
Interesting.
sit around smoking ganja. And one of the first things that they do is jeer the British colonial authorities as they march through the streets of India. And the Brits didn't like this at all. These sadhus were annoying. They're na they're naked, they're scabby, they smoke drugs all day, and they laugh at us.
That's great.
So and in the 1830s, the British had decided, because they're so open-minded, to abolish slavery in most of their colonies, including in Jamaica, where they had their sugarcane plantations. And surprisingly, the enslaved Africans who were in Jamaica, brought by the British to work in these plantations, didn't want to work for the British anymore. So the British figured out we're going to import labor from India. We're going to round up these sadhus, invent something. It was, what is it? Indebted laborers. They would create debts and say, you can get over your debt, you can own some land, and you get on this boat, and we'll take you to this place, and you'll be free to work, and so on. So between 1830 and 1910, I think something like 36,000 sadhus were taken from India to Jamaica. They took their ganja with them. They took their chillums with them. They took their dreadlocks with them. They took their vegetarian ways, their anti-colonial Pacific rebellion ways, mixed up with Africans who were now free, smoked together. The Indians were smoking their ganja with tobacco
Hmm.
in chillums. The African Jamaicans were smoking it pure in water pipes. That's the main difference. But this bringing these sadhus out of India and dumping them in Jamaica, the subsequent blend created Rastafarianism. We hear a lot about Ethiopia and Africa, the African roots of Rastafarianism, but in fact, it has twin roots. It also has very clear Hindu roots. Um, so these are the twists and turns of they. It seems pretty clear that the Sadhus were the ones who brought cannabis to Jamaica.
Hmm.
No
Yeah.
evidence that enslaved Africans did. So people like the British running their empire, displacing people across the world, they also displaced the plant. They got the end result was people blending together. Rastafarianism is an indirect result of the British Empire. But, so those are the kind of quirky stories that are part of the cannabis story. Um, what
That's
I
a
like, I'm not happy that enslaved people were taken. I mean, there must have been a lot of suffering in all
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
But it's true that when you follow the cannabis plant, you get to see human business in all its what is it? I know, kind of brutishness.
Hmm.
There's no disguising the power games that people play when you follow the plant around.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a fascinating bit of information to me personally. Anyway, I love that. I didn't know that. I mean, I knew that people from India had gone to Jamaica, and I didn't know the extent of that, and and the sort of kind of I don't know, almost fun, fascinating fact that you could thank the British for Bob Marley, essentially, right? Yeah. Um,
I mean, I wouldn't want to put it that way, but you can certainly say that.
yeah. Okay, so moving on, we could talk all day about that because you have a lot of fascinating things. I would have, if we had more time, I don't want to actually, Jeremy, but if we had more time, I had not known, for example, about the role of Henri Michaud, and although I'm very familiar with Allen Ginsberg and his work, I didn't know the extent of his influence on it. But let's leave that for people to explore in the book. Um, Here's another topic that I find interesting. You spoke a few moments ago about the difficulty of properly studying this plant and the biases that were built in. Um, for example, I don't want to go into this one either, I don't think, but are you familiar with Dr. Peter Grinspoon and his book, Seeing Through the Smoke? Have you ever come
Yeah,
across that one? Yeah.
yeah.
He talks about four kinds of biases, and why the studies on cannabis have gone in a negative direction oftentimes, and publication bias and confirmation bias, for example. So, but going into this a little bit more, a term I had not come across before is in the book, and it's the iron law of prohibition. Can you talk about that a little bit and its implications?
Yes, well, as you know, there was a prohibition of alcohol in the United States between 1920 and 1933. And what was illegal then was not drinking the alcohol, but producing, transporting, and selling it. Um, that was the 18th Amendment that was enacted in 1920. Um, the result of this was that no one was going to be smuggling around a barrel of beer if you're going to be smuggling a barrel of something, it might as well be whiskey, because you can get, I don't know, 4 times more people drunk on that barrel if it's whiskey rather than beer. So, yes, people turn to producing whiskey, selling whiskey, drinking whiskey because that's all there was. The price of beer went up 700%. The price of whiskey went up 300%.
Huh.
So drinks were available but more expensive. The concentrated spirits were less expensive dose per dose compared to the beer, and beer was not only hard to find but extremely expensive, and the two
Hmm.
go together. The iron law is that because the greatest price of delivering, distributing, and selling an illegal product is avoiding detection, uh, the iron law says that the more law enforcement increases, punishing people for the using the prohibited substance, or rather for selling it and producing it, the more the potency of that illegal substance is going to increase. So people prefer beer, but we're going to give them whiskey because we got to conceal it, basically. And that's what happened during the prohibition of alcohol. And then when the prohibition was removed and people could drink alcohol again, it was, of course, within the laws that they enacted after that. But, people go back to drinking wine and beer much more readily than drinking spirits. So when cannabis prohibition came along and started being heavily enforced in the 1970s, and then so the war on drugs, 1970s, 1980s, early 1980s. I mean, Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1971, but it was the Reagan government in 1980 that really went into heavy anti-cannabis helicopters in California, federal agents, and so on, war on drugs. I mean, people were going to prison for years for growing it, selling it, also consuming it, buying it. And at that time, the cannabis was becoming stronger and stronger. It was sinsamy. Instead of being weak, imported leaf from Mexico, it was seedless flowers from California dripping in psychoactive resin. And so the cannabis that people were consuming, as law enforcement became more severe, cannabis itself became stronger in terms of THC percentage through the 1980s.
Hmm.
And actually, the strength, the potency of cannabis just kept on rising from through the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s, through the first decade of the 2000s. But where the iron law actually doesn't work with cannabis is that, and this is, I think, pretty interesting, is that when it became recreational cannabis became legal in certain jurisdictions, California, Colorado. If the iron law had been correct, you would think that the high potency levels of certain herbs, certain products, cannabis products, would go back down
Hmm.
because the law enforcement against it was removed. But in fact, it continued going up and up. Um, and that there's a whole segment of the legal market, like 20% of the consumers go after high potency products if they're available, and make up, in some places, in some states in the US, like 50% of the sales come from 20% of the clients
Hmm.
going after the high potency stuff. So, um, actually, the iron law may have been correct with whiskey and beer, but it's looking pretty rusty when it comes to the transformations of cannabis potency in the last 50 years.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm sure a lot of that has to do with the competitive imperative of the capitalist, structure that we live under. But maybe it's pendulums tend to swing back at some point, oftentimes. So maybe over time, people will start to realize. And speaking of that, I'm going to jump ahead to a question or a point that you made in the book briefly, where you said that you increasingly appreciate mild cannabis. Can you say why that is?
Sure. Well, I mean, I went to college in California in the early 1980s, so I know about Sensimilla in the 1980s in California. And the idea was always the stronger it is, the better it is. Um, and the ideal being one toke dope. You'd hit one hit of this, and wow. Um, now people, some experts are looking at, what is this idea that stronger is better? Some of it say it's a holdover from prohibitionist days because uh, the traffickers, the people who are supplying the market, if it's illegal and people are going to pay more for more potent stuff, then yes, there's more money to be made with more potent stuff. So that is also what favored this producing stronger herb,
Hmm.
selling it, and then this idea that it's better. As I was writing this book, yeah, I've actually never been a huge fan of like one toke dope. I mean, I grow my stuff in my garden, and I take three, four hits at least because it's just not that strong.
Hmm.
But on working on this book and seeing that actually there's a dosage with cannabis is an important question. Um, the more you use it, the more habituated you get. So the kind of the more you need. Um, Actually, most of the interesting effects occur at lower to middle doses, and most of the problems and I mean, starting with you can't find your keys or you forgot what you were doing, all that occurs at higher doses.
Yeah.
So that actually, what I would be looking for is some kind of sweet spot uh, between the low and medium dose and trying to
Hmm.
keep and so it's easier. It's simply if you grow some or you purchase some cannabis, herbal cannabis that is 10 or 15%, it's perfectly good. And okay, so you need to take one or two hits more than you would if it were 20 or 25%.
Hmm.
Um, um, but if it's agreeable, if it's good cannabis, you can appreciate it. I vaporize now, so
Hmm.
I like the taste of the vapor. I see no problem with having to take two or three hits of vapor rather than just one. To,
Hmm.
on the contrary, what's so great about having it so concentrated? So that's why I appreciate it more. I think part of the pleasure is also in the aromatic. It's like with wine, it's not just the alcohol it contains,
Hmm.
also the aromatic experience.
Yeah, before we had legalization in Canada, there was kind of an agreement amongst the police just to leave the shops alone, and we had 150 illegal shops in Vancouver at one point, and they had no problem. They didn't hassle them unless they did really stupid things. And in those days, a lot of the people working in those shops said the best way to tell what you like is to smell it, and you could open the jar and smell it. Um, but now that we have legalization, it's all sort of sealed packages, and you don't get to do that anymore. And just a fun thought here, by the way, on that notion of dosage. Uh, Neil Young, the great singer-songwriter, has wrote a memoir a few years ago. I think it's called "Waging Peace." Anyway, he cannabis had a lot to do with his creativity, his song output. think he pretty much wrote most of those beautiful songs under the influence. But he said, if you smoked a little, you wrote a song. If you smoked a lot, you were just toast.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's it.
yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask you about, okay, so yeah, this one, because I'd never heard of it before, and it seems like it's worthy of a bit of discussion, and that is THCP. What the heck is that? What is it?
So tetrahydrocannabiferol. Um, in 2019, a team of Italian researchers discovered this cannabinoid in very small amounts in certain cannabis plants. In its acidic form. So THC is produced in its acidic form. So THC is THCA, and you have to heat it up to turn it into THC. The same with CBDA has to be heated up to become CBD, and THCPA is what is in the plant. And when you heat it up like the other cannabis, it becomes THCP. So this is a substance that the plant produces. So it's a naturally occurring cannabinoid, but it occurs in such tiny amounts that you just could not uh, produce it by growing plants. You'd have to grow just an enormous amount of plants to extract a very small amount of THCPA. It turns out so THCP is something like it binds to the cannabis receptors like 30 times more tightly than THC does. So this doesn't mean that it's 30 times stronger, equal weight. Some people say it's 4 to 8 times stronger than THC. It would seem that it locks into the receptor much more tightly than THC does. THC is a partial agonist, so it kind of gloms on for a while and then goes away. THCP would go lock in for longer. So it's similar effects at low doses, but they can also be much stronger. And it's unstudied, so when you say, what is it? We want to know more about it exactly. It's being produced industrially. In other words, you can grow large amounts of cannabis and take the CBD out of it or the CBG out of it, and then use chemicals to transform this CBD, because CBD has the same atomic structure and identity as THC.
Hmm.
So it's the same, more or less, it just slight differences in it has the same chemical formula. So you can take CBD and modify it chemically with acetate or what have you, and add things to it, take things away from it. And you can actually, with complicated chemical procedures, but if you have a lab and chemists, you can transform CBD into THCP. So this is industrially produced THCP, but it actually is a molecule that originally comes from the plant in terms of the plant invented it. And they've taken CBD from the plant and then turned it into a semi-synthetic THCP. It's not illegal in many states, in many places yet. Uh, and it's being included in some edibles in like, gas stations. You can buy these kind of products, often in edibles. And it's easy because it's so powerful. It's easy to take way too much of it. And then, I mean, there are lots of people who have been out of sorts for days, even weeks, after just taking a gummy because it's not controlled. You don't really know how much THCP is in there. It's easy for it to be way too strong. You actually wonder, I mean, apart from the fact that it is not illegal in jurisdictions in some jurisdictions where THC is illegal. So it'll give you a cannabis-like experience if you get the dosage right.
Hmm.
and without it being an illegal act. Still, you wonder, apart from that, why people would be attracted to it. You know that people are interested in new cannabinoids. I mean, some people are. So, ooh, THCP, ooh, I'll try that. But it's so under-researched, under-studied. We don't actually know about it. I mean, so yes, okay, let's say it's 8 times stronger than THC. It may have therapeutic applications. Who knows? It does seem to have its dangers, mainly simply because it's way stronger,
Right.
and we don't really know that much about it. So that's what it is. I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, I don't recommend people consume anything, but certainly not THCP.
Yeah, good to know. Well, I don't know if, as you say, if people would even know they are taking it, but I think it's good information to be out there. So thank you for sharing that. Sort of on the chemical side of things, again, in the book you speak about some of the synthetic, analogs and cannabis-like drugs, and the one in particular that stood out to me was one called AMB or AM Fubinaca. And that was some time ago when that was a problem. Is it still a problem?
Yeah, well, all of these actually, I think that to answer correctly your interesting questions, it always takes a little bit. I've got to back up a little bit. Um, Synthetic cannabinoids, most of them, the whole idea, were invented by scientists working in laboratories in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Um, they were trying to see if they modified the THC molecule, which was the active one, um, could they turn it into an interesting painkiller? And, this approach had been used previously with morphine and so forth. So let's fiddle around with THC. So they fiddled around. They made all kinds of different molecules, either variations of THC or molecules designed to mimic THC, but that were not chemically identical. So all of these, what they called synthetic cannabinoids, each time they'd publish their results in scientific journals and with patents because they were working for chemical companies mainly. And all this goes in the public domain. And then suddenly in the 2000s, they started finding, once again, kind of gas station products called spice, cannabis-like smoking herbal mixtures,
Hmm.
but actually cheap, ordinary herbs sprinkled with various of these synthetic cannabinoids where underground chemists had simply taken the information out of the scientific literature and so you would find these molecules. So AMB Fubinaca started cropping up um, around 2012. And the thing about it is that it's apparently fairly easy to make. It has no direct relationship with the THC molecule, but it does activate the same cannabinoid receptor in our bodies. It activates it in a different way. It's a full agonist. It goes into the receptor and locks in there. It's not a partial agonist like THC, which only leans on the receptor for a while and then goes away. Um, that's what a lot of these synthetic cannabinoids do. And they were looking for molecules that would be more effective, that would lock on that. So that's why they made all these substances. I mean, some of these synthetic cannabinoids lock into the receptor 1,000 times more effectively than THC does. And some people who've taken these things have had nightmarish experiences of like hallucinating, heart racing for like 48 hours and so on. Um, AMB Fubinaca, this was something that you could cook up really easily in a bucket,
Hmm.
and you could sell a gram of this stuff for like $3. And I think 1 gram could be sprayed on vegetal matter and produce like 500 doses. You could get 500 people
Amazing.
seriously stoned with 3 grams of this powder.
Hmm.
Um, the only problem was that you can spray unequally, you can miscalculate the dose, and there were outbreaks of people, so that suddenly you're taking 100 times the dose of just getting a buzz. And at this point, they like in 2016, there was a zombie outbreak in Brooklyn reported in the New York Times. Um, you know, People wandering the streets, literally like zombies, collapsing, unable to talk. In this case, within 9 hours, these people had all fully recovered. I mean, there are even images of this on YouTube, zombie outbreak Brooklyn. And at the time, the New York Times put it, synthetic marijuana produces zombie outbreak. But actually, AMB Fubinaca has nothing to do with cannabis or marijuana. It's a chemical that is of completely different nature than THC. It doesn't have the same structure. It has nothing to do with the plant. It's a full agonist of the receptor, and it can kill people. So there were outbreaks of the AMB Fubinaca in New Zealand, and like I think 100, more than 100 people, or just slightly less than 100 people, died over 2, 3 years. Often, people without much money, people living in the streets. In New Zealand, Maori people. It's cheap. It gets you really wasted. Um, and it kills people who are vulnerable. When people die from like it's often people with heart conditions. I think half the people who died in New Zealand had a previously recognized cardiovascular. Um, but the whole point with these substances is, as soon as they're identified, AMB Fubinaca wasn't unknown to science. It was a modified version of a molecule that Pfizer had made. In the patent, it explained how you could modify it. They did modify it. They made AMB Fubinaca. Then so it wasn't yet illegal, and then it became illegal in different countries. Um, so then they take another of these synthetic cannabinoids and they make another variation. And so nowadays, I think that AMB Fubinaca is less available, but it's been replaced by other cannabinoids. What has changed in the last 10 years is that there was a fad for spice products, which were in fact synthetic cannabinoids. Um, and people were attracted to them because if they were trying to avoid drug tests, because these molecules are not THC, so they don't show up if you're
Mm.
tested for THC. They're cheap and so on. Um, there was a kind of a fad taking them. That fad, it would seem, has largely gone away. But what you still have people in the margins. So um, people who don't have too much money, people who don't have a home, prisoners as well, because it's small, powerful, easy to smuggle into prisons.
Mhm.
So it's not that many people. Like in the States, I think it's 750,000 people use synthetic cannabinoids in 2023. That's like 1/4% of the adult population. So it's not much.
Mhm.
But concentrated in certain populations, like in Britain, it's like 46% of prisoners in UK prisons have used synthetic cannabinoids in the last year.
Mhm. Hmm.
So these substances remain dangerous. They're hard to dose. They can kill you. They're not the same as THC. So it's a pretty murky. And then there's always the problem, you can be at a place and somebody can say, here, have some of this. And you don't know what's in there. Now that there are synthetic cannabinoids that exist in the world, it makes sense to really want to so that you know what you smoke.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, legalization, a good thing in that way, hopefully, especially if there's proper inspection. Canada does seem to have that for the most part, thankfully. So, kind of moving in a slightly different direction here, what I've been wanting to do with this interview, Jeremy, is pick out topics that would be of general interest and relevance to people for the most part. And I think so far you've done a stellar job of doing that with my questions. And this one I found very interesting as well, because I didn't know this. But you mentioned that women tend to experience cannabis differently than men. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I put it slightly differently because actually studies show that men and women have pretty similar experiences. In other words, women get the munchies too. Women appreciate music more. So the kind of effects that cannabis is known for and appreciated for, there you don't find big differences between men and women.
Okay.
Uh, um, but there are still all kinds of differences that I'll get into. Um, but the first thing is that until recently, there were no studies on this. So the studies that exist are recent. And so what one can say about the subject is kind of preliminary. But still, I think it's important um, to know that women need less cannabis to get the same effect. In other words, they're more sensitive to cannabis and THC than men are, which is good for them. It means that, they can, the same dose, the same amount of cannabis is going to go further if a woman is using it than if a man is using it. Um, it's true. It would seem that when people become dependent on cannabis, those people who become dependent on cannabis, women become dependent on cannabis faster than men do. So,
Mm,
there's some differences.
mm,
Um, there's also so women tend, I mean, these are generalizations, but when you ask women who use cannabis, women report that they use cannabis for different reasons than men do. In other words, more from medical reasons, pain relief, menstrual cramps, um, anxiety. Um, Even though it's obvious that women actually report also more anxiety from cannabis, so that a low dose can calm you, whether you're a man or you're a woman, but a high dose can create anxiety, and this is true for both men and women. But uh, women report feeling anxious once they've consumed cannabis more than men do. They also report that they take cannabis to reduce anxiety. So, it's not a sort of a simple picture. Um, but then there's also the thing that the effect of THC cannabis on a woman is going to depend on her cycle if she is a woman who is menstruating. So most women between the ages of, I don't know, 13 and 50 something have menstrual cycles. And those women who do have menstrual cycles, the cycle is estrogen. You have more or less at the beginning of the cycle, there's less estrogen, and then it goes up as ovulation, it goes down, goes back up. So there's a variation of estrogen levels in a woman's body, which you do not have in a man's body. And when estrogen levels are low, the cannabis receptors are more available because the body's own cannabinoid, which is anandamide, is part of what goes on in a woman's body related to estrogen. And so when there are low levels of estrogen, the anandamide is not busy occupying the cannabis receptors, and so those receptors are available. So at the same amount of THC will have a different effect on the same woman, depending on where she's at in her cycle. Um,
yeah.
so, and men just don't have this. So I think that if you're a woman, it kind of it's good to know, for example, that you need less than the men who are in the room consuming
I think
to
it's
get.
good for the men around those women to know that as well, for, being sensitive and considerate about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and health people say that they should put on packages of stuff that's sold legally, to the attention of women that it can produce anxiety because
Mm,
we report this. As soon as they smoke too much, they can get all anxious, much sooner and in greater numbers than men would.
right.
Um, anyway, yeah, I think there are kind of fundamental differences between a man's body and a woman's body. I know that there are then people who are don't identify as either or as both, and that's another question. But I mean, the great majority of the population, you're a man, you're a woman, and the differences, the bodily differences in terms of the organs and the hormones and so on, where a woman's body is different from a man, it's really rare that in that part of the body that there are not endocannabinoid receptors. So the reason why women are so sensitive to men
Mm,
is also that the biological woman is enmeshed with endocannabinoid receptors, and substances like anandamide are crucial all over our bodies in general, but the female body in particular. So that means that all of these different functions, I mean, mother's milk and the uterus and so forth, there are all these cannabinoid receptors in there. So if you're consuming cannabinoids, there will be an effect to a certain extent.
hmm Yeah. More fascinating and really useful information, Jeremy. I've got a lot of questions that we're not going to have time to get to, but I do want to get to a couple more here. Um, uh, Near the end of the book, you said you talked about two main unanswered questions going forward. One is male fertility, and the other one is pregnancy and early brain development. Can you talk a little bit about those, please?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a continuing on from just what we were saying.
Hmm
So there are the receptor on which THC does its thing is called the CB1, the cannabinoid receptor 1. In the body, normally, it's a substance called anandamide that activates that receptor. And so it turns out that sperm cells are covered in CB1 receptors. And in the man's body, and then when a sperm cell gets into the female reproductive tract, um, it needs to be transformed, and anandamide in the woman's reproductive tract is going to start working on the sperm cell, so as to enable it to changes its membrane, and these changes are necessary for it to be able to swim properly, and when it reaches the egg, to be able to penetrate the egg's membrane and fertilize it. Without these changes done by the body's natural endocannabinoid, the sperm's motility, the sperm numbers, the sperm capacity to fertilize are largely diminished. So, if there is THC in the female reproductive tract, it's reasonable to think that it could disrupt what the normal work that the body's cannabinoid does. And there is some evidence that men who consume cannabis and their female partners who consume cannabis, the end result is that there's less sperm, it's less mobile, it's less able to fertilize an egg. That is, there are pretty clear results showing that that's true. Still, the extent to which it's truly a problem is far from demonstrated. I mean, you don't have a whole bunch of babies with birth defects being born to fathers who smoke cannabis. You know, that if there were, we'd know about it. Um, Perhaps it's simply because the sperm that actually do quite nicely and make it through, they can do. I mean, there's like 100 million sperm with each ejaculation. Uh, you know, so there's an ample number of candidates. So there's perhaps less of them. Perhaps some of them swim less well. But finally, you know, so more research is needed. The studies haven't been done. It's only just getting started. I mean, a lot more on these basic subjects is known about nicotine or the opiates or alcohol. And it's only now that public health science research is catching up and looking into this. But basically, you know, the population level studies haven't been done. They recommend doctors in such cases, you know, they recommend prudence. So they say if you want to become the father of a child through heterosexual reproduction or what have you, ideally for your sperm to be in good shape, you would not consume cannabis for 74 days, which is the cycle to produce sperm, the spermato generating cycle. So you stop smoking for 74 days and then your sperm should be normal. Um, that's what they say.
Yeah.
Um, More research is needed. I think they're saying it's more like out of caution than anything.
Yes. Understood. And then with women and pregnancy and brain development.
Okay, well, here it's a similar thing. It's a recent research. THC that a mother consumes gets into her body, gets into her blood, um, it gets into the placenta. So if she's pregnant, there's going to be THC in the embryo is going to have THC. And once again, the body's endocannabinoid anandamide also plays a key role in sculpting the connections between the neurons in the unfolding brain. And basically, the more you can keep cannabinoids away from developing brains, the better. Even the studies are recent. There's not a huge amount of evidence that um, uh, babies are damaged and so forth, but there is emerging evidence that uh, mothers who smoke cannabis give birth. They come to term faster. Their
Mm.
babies weigh less. This is
Mm.
also true with alcohol. It's also true with nicotine. Um,
Mm.
the studies are only just beginning with cannabis. The second problem is that because the cannabinoids they like lipids, they like fats, attach to fats and lipids. So mother's milk is filled with lipids. So when a mother is breastfeeding, um, and actually, there's usually anandamide, the body's own endocannabinoid in mother's milk, and it does several things, including it stimulates the appetite of the baby, it encourages feeding, but it also, once the baby has ingested the anandamide, it also helps the brain be set up and so forth. It does a lot of things in the newborn's body and brain. But if there's THC in the body, it gets
Mm.
transmitted through the milk and it gets into the baby's body that way. And once again, the more you can keep THC out of the newborn's body
Mhm.
and brain, I think the better. That said, uh, I think that the consensus among doctors is that breastfeeding is so positive that it outweighs by far the negative effects that have been determined
Mhm.
for newborns. So doctors would rather a mother who consumes cannabis breastfeed anyway
Mhm.
than not breastfeed,
Yeah.
even though they recommend that mothers who are breastfeeding not consume cannabis. Um, anyway, so that's my understanding of
Yeah.
And once again, research is ongoing. The population level studies are only just starting. Doctors recommend caution. So doctors, I mean, pregnant mothers is like, you can't drink, you can't smoke, not when you're pregnant, even though you may have back pain and so forth, and not when you're breastfeeding. Basically, you got to just sort of um, stay sober.
Right. So the watchword here is intelligent caution, I would say. So I have one more question for you, Jeremy. It's actually it's got three answers, I guess, because, the subtitle of the book, which, by the way, if people are only listening to this, I didn't mention the title of the book at the beginning. It's called The Cannabis Book, but the subtitle at the top is The History and Future of the Plant and the Drug. So we haven't really talked about the future. And at the very end of the book, you said there are three likely most significant trends for the future of cannabis: industrial manufacturing, growth of craft cultivation, and emergence of nonprofit production. Can you give us a little brief rundown on those three likely significant trends?
Yeah, well, I'll just say that talking about the future is always pretty speculative. Um, Anybody can say anything, and we won't know until we get there whether it's true or not. But still, people who kind of take these things, people who talk about trends and um, there's like market predictions and so forth. There are people who actually are fairly serious and rigorous about how they talk about what might be coming next. And one of the main methods is to take current trends and then follow their logical extension. So then what are current trends? To me, these three stood out. So since the 2010s, the legal cannabis industry has exploded in countries like Canada, United States. I mean, Canada, I think, is the biggest exporter of medical cannabis in the world. Uh, the legal cannabis industry now, it's like a $25 billion industry. That was last year. It's projected to be 100 billion in 2030. So it's like it has extraordinary growth, and the business world is talking about this. And so, what is this? Well, this is growing plants in hyper sophisticated factory environments where everything is entirely controlled. The plants are standardized. So it's this industrial scale of treating the plant as a sort of basic material, which can then be transformed, extracted, turned into different products. I mean, it's industrialization of cannabis products. I think that actually the herbal cannabis that we used to smoke, this is actually the sort of raw material that they're using to transform into all kinds of vape juices or edibles or
Beers.
beers and nano. And so, I mean, some of these new cannabis products, they even challenge the definition of cannabis, like, something like a nano THC drink. This is okay. It's THC extracted from these factory grown plants, but then nano emulsified, which is that the oily THC molecule is surrounded by in these high-speed blenders. It's turned into this molecule that has water molecules stuck to it with some emulsifiers. And so it becomes water soluble instead of fat soluble. So it works more like alcohol in the body. Alcohol is water soluble. So you drink it already starts going into your blood system through your throat. It goes into your body, which is 70% water, within 10 minutes. It goes into your bloodstream and into your brain, and just like alcohol does. Whereas when you eat or drink ordinary THC, it's going to have to go through your stomach, get digested, and it won't actually start working for at least 30 minutes, more likely an hour. So they're turning nano THC drink is cannabis made water soluble. But cannabis by its nature is lipid soluble. It's not water soluble. So it's the same THC molecule. It's made in the plant, but it's made to behave like alcohol. Um, is this still cannabis? If they were doing something like this with wine, if you did the analogous thing where you take wine, extract alcohol from it, and then treat it in such a way that it would become fat soluble rather than water soluble, and behave more like a cannabis edible than like an alcoholic drink, probably people would not agree with you calling it a wine product or a grape product. It's been turned into something else.
And they'd be
It's,
up all night.
I don't think it would be a good idea to do it,
No.
but so then some of anyhow, that's the first trend, the
Yeah.
industrialization of
Right.
cannabis. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and nothing indicates that it's going to be going away or shrinking anytime
Mhm.
soon.
No.
Um, Second futuristic trend, or are we out of time already?
Uh,
I can speed it up.
well, I don't want to go too much longer, but I think these
Speed it
two
up.
are my two favorite of the three likely trends, especially the growth of craft cultivation. But I also think that emergence of nonprofit production is got a lot of potential in a good way for the culture.
Well, so the craft cultivation, it's actually already happening in California. California is leading the way on a world level here.
Up here too in Canada.
Yeah, is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay,
Starting.
because um, controlled origin is the system, appellation system is what they use in wine. So that they say this is fresh Champagne, it's from Champagne. This is Bordeaux, it's from Bordeaux. This is Napa Valley, it's from Napa Valley. This is Porto, from Porto. You can't produce a sparkling wine and call it champagne unless you're in Champagne. And if you do, you can go to prison and so forth. I mean, um, and this has allowed niche wine regions to get a premium for their product and, to cultivate their standards and so forth. So the idea is to take recognized cannabis terroir, places of outdoor sunshine and complex soils, and with a knowledge of how to produce a good product like in Burgundy or Bordeaux. But for cannabis in the United States, Humboldt County, Mendocino County, and create an appellation so that you can sell outdoor, sun-grown, quite the opposite of this factory-grown standardized stuff, not standardized. With the variability, this is what makes the wine business is that each year is a different wine, uh,
Hmm.
in the appellation system. And so is to bring standards and recognition for particular places with particular know-how to produce quality products. And so this is already happening in California. One could imagine it's in the future where you could get controlled origin Thai sticks from northern Thailand, or Kashmir hashish from Kashmir, and you could or keef from the Reef Mountains in Morocco, or Mendocino or Acapulco gold or whatever,
Hmm.
as in the cigar shops of today. In other words, specialized places where you pay a premium, but you know that what
Yeah.
you're paying for is the guaranteed product. So this may be part of the future.
I think it is, and I think it's overall a good thing, personally. And by the way, speaking of that kind of cultivation in Canada, or the not necessarily even just the cultivation locally here, but I get the newsletters from several different organizations that sell cannabis online, and they're selling and promoting hashish from a range of places, far-flung places in the world, Afghan hashish and Moroccan and, you know, things like that. So, it's getting pretty interesting that way. So what about the nonprofit production issue?
Well, here too, it's something that's already happening. The first time it happened at the level of a country was in Uruguay in 2013, where the government said, okay, we're going to legalize recreational use. And we're going to organize it. So Uruguayan citizens have three options. They can grow six plants for their own consumption, but the plants must not be visible from the public space. Or they can join a cannabis social club with a limit of 70 other people, I think. No club can have more than 70 members. They can grow maybe two plants per person. Um, and then within their club, they can purchase something like 40 grams of cannabis a year. I think the total that they can purchase is something like 480 grams a year. That's also the amount that you're allowed to grow with your six plants. And then the third possibility, and these possibilities are mutually exclusive, you can go down to a pharmacy and in Uruguay purchase cannabis that is state controlled and that has a precise THC level. It used to be only 9%.
Mm.
Now, recently, I think you can buy four kinds of cannabis in the Uruguayan pharmacies. So it's 9%, 12, 15, and now 20%.
Mm.
Can buy those. There's no THC limits on what you can grow or what's grown in the club, but in what you can buy in a pharmacy, they control the limits. They have clear packaging, and there it is. So that's what's known as the Uruguayan model. They started enacting it in like 2018. Uh, the Germans picked up the Uruguayan model and brought it in. So the Germany legalized recreational cannabis in 2024 on the basis of the Uruguayan model, but they tweaked it. You can't purchase it in pharmacies yet. You can either grow three plants at home or join a cannabis social club. And here too, you can purchase, I think it's 50 grams a month or something. But then they have all kinds of rules, like if you're between 18 and 21, you can only purchase 30 grams a month.
Mm.
And it can only be cannabis of 10%,
Mm.
not more. There's no THC limit for people over 21%, either at home or in the club. But then the Germans, I've actually read the German legislation. It's like 70 pages of rules of what you can and can't do. And they're pretty interesting. You cannot smoke cannabis in a pedestrian zone between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m.
Right.
You cannot smoke cannabis in front of a minor.
Mm.
Um, you cannot make edibles. You can go to prison for 3 years if you make edibles because they're dangerous to children.
That's
So
caution.
no edibles. Um, So they have rules like that. Sometimes the rules are a little bit contradictory. They say you can grow three plants, but then they say at no moment are you allowed to own more than 50 grams of dried cannabis. So you think, but wait, how can you grow three plants and only have 50 grams of dried? And you're not allowed to give it away. You're not allowed to share cannabis, to give it. You're certainly not allowed to sell it. So the Germans are still working it out. Um, but they're taking the problem, as it should be taken. They're treating it like alcohol is treated. In other words, you can't just produce any old alcohol and
Mhm.
use it any way at any moment and give it to anybody. No, you have to have pretty clear rules with these things. So
That
there's
sounds like the things the German would do. I mean, they have the Bavarian, 500-year-old laws for beer production, right? Yeah.
Well, you're so right. Is actually the German law says that regional authorities for specific events can forbid cannabis. So Oktoberfest in Bavaria, they're pretty anti-cannabis in Bavaria, truth be told.
Mm.
They've said no cannabis at the beer fest. Um, 1,500 euro, or dollar fine for the first infraction
Mm.
and 5,000 euros for the next. So very steep fines for smoking recreational cannabis, which is legal in the rest of the country, on the grounds of the Oktoberfest.
I think they're trying to
Uh,
protect their brand there. Anyway, Jeremy, this has been, for me personally, fascinating, really. You're just a font of great information, and I'm sure people viewing or listening to this will find that the same. And there's a hell of a lot more like that in the book, folks. So I strongly recommend it. It's a great book, really well written, accessible. It's not dry, considering the amount of information that's in it. And again, it's called The Book of Cannabis, by Jeremy Narby. And it is to be published in April of 2026, and it'll be available everywhere, I'm sure. It's with a well-respected publisher. So, just a quick little plug for the work that I'm doing, folks. There are about 30 more of similar kinds of interviews on the Stephen Gray Vision YouTube channel, and also recently started a Substack. It's called New Transformation Chronicles. If you subscribe to it, it's free, and then you'll get my short little posts that I put out so far about once every week or two. So on that cheery note, I'll say thanks so much for doing this, Jeremy, and thank you, and I hope to keep in touch with you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.